In this video, I want to talk a little bit about the design of Eastern State Penitentiary and some of the problems that quickly developed. So, in textbooks, when we talk about the separate and silent system, we generally think about it as a continuous process just from the beginning until the end. Inmates were forbidden from talking, they were kept separate from other inmates. But the reality is that that's a very complicated idea, and the reality of putting people in prison and managing them um, and keeping them alive, feeding them, whatever it is that we're talking about in daily prison life, makes separation very hard. The other thing that we'll always keep in mind when we talk about a separate and silent system is the idea of separation becomes very costly very quickly. So, as we talk about any prison, if we say, for example, a 500 cell prison, if that prison is separate and silent, you can hold 500 prisoners. If you have 501 prisoners, you either make a choice of being no longer separate and silent, or you build a 501st cell or a new prison and start the process all over again. So that's going to become a challenge. The thing about Eastern State Penitentiary is it became a challenge while they were still building the prison. So this is not a situation in which decades down the road we got too many prisoners and we had to make a change. Almost immediately, crowding became an issue, and that's going to change the original design of the prison. And you can see that as we come back to our model. This was originally designed to be a very symmetrical prison. So the idea was you would have 7 identical cell blocks, and you can see these 1, 2, and 3 cells. So this is cell block 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And you can tell cell blocks 1 through 3 have a lot of similarities. Cell blocks 4, 5, 6, and 7 are a little bit different. So during the construction of the Eastern State, we realized after we constructed these first 3 cell blocks that we were going to need more room. So during the construction phase, the last 4 cell blocks were altered. So they were altered in 2 ways. First, they were lengthened. So you can kind of tell, in particular with 7, it becomes very apparent. 4, 5, 6, and 7 are a bit longer than the first 3. So they were lengthened, and then they were also made 2-tiered or 2 stories. So these 4 have a bottom floor and a top floor. So they already, during the construction of the prison, had to account for crowding. So you can see that it's not symmetrical. It looks a little bit strange that way. I've tried. I was not able to find anything, or I would have put it in the video. I tried to find a diagram, a drawing of the original cell or the original blueprint, plan, design, looking as symmetrical as possible, and I can't find one. This is as good of a model as you'll find. The major characteristic that stands out as you're looking at this model, which is unique to not maybe not this prison. It's the only prison that I can confirm for sure did this. I'm not 100% about what went on with the rebuild at Western State, whether they did this or not. But the thing that stands out about these are all of these little individual recreation yards. Never seen anything like this in any prison that currently operates. It is an insane idea to have every prisoner exercise in their own recreation yard attached to their cell. So that's to be separate and silent. Inmates could not share a rec yard. It would have been a challenging prospect to create a kind of shared rec yard and manage it where only one inmate could be out there at a time. So this was kind of uh, the solution to keeping everybody separate, but also allowing them time outside. They each have their own rec yard. Um, if you're thinking ahead, you've found a problem or a flaw. You'll notice that outside of the second story of 4, 5, 6, and 7, there is not a upper level courtyard floating in the air. So during the construction, this idea is already being challenged. We need a solution. So early on, as they build the second tiered cell blocks 4, 5, 6, and 7, they used uh, a second cell on the upper level attached to the inmates' cell living quarters as a recreation yard on the second floor. So we can see that in this model of cell block 7. You can see here's a cell, the cell, an upper level cell, and you can see as we look at the gallery, um, one, you can make note that the gallery itself on the top is inset a little bit. And this is so the doors are not flush with the first floor, and this is to allow more light to come through to the bottom level. But if you look here, you can see there's a door that would enter the cell, and then inside there's a second door that connects to the adjoining cell or space, as it would have been to allow for recreation. I don't have a date, don't have numbers, but at some point we would have converted those to these indoor recreation yards into housing. We would have had too many prisoners eventually. We would have had to use them, and this idea of separate and silent would have started breaking down. And that's the thing about Eastern State and separate and silent is we have a pretty good timeline. So as we look at our model, the construction of the prison starts. We complete the first three probably around 1829. Construction continues. The original prison is completed in 1836. 1877, 4 new cell blocks are built in between the existing cell blocks. These did not have individual recreation yards, so already by that time we've abandoned, for the most part, individual recreation, so it didn't last that long. 1913 is the year in which the prison officially abandoned its separate and silent system of confinement. By all accounts, even from this early beginning, separate and silent was more of a philosophy than a reality at Eastern State. And then 1970 is really the year where the prison stopped functioning as a fully operational prison. It wouldn't have been until 1971 until all inmates have left the prison. Even when the majority of inmates left in 1970, a few remained behind. But 1971, the prison closes. So we talk about this timeline. We'll kind of keep this idea in mind that even though it's designed for separate and silent, that didn't last very long. I'll show you a model cell off of cell block 1, 2, and 3. This is what cell blocks 1 through 3 would have looked like. An interesting feature. So we have these cells, individual courtyards. In the interior of the hallway inside the housing unit or the cell block, we would have had these very small doors, and in the model you can kind of see this pipe. Today in prison we'd call it kind of like a bean chute. These walls are much thicker than our what we would use now. Sometimes you hear the term bean chute. They probably wouldn't have called it a bean chute then. That's what we would call it now. But that was the only access to the cell in the interior of the cell block. The original cell block was designed to only be accessible from the outside. So to escort a prisoner, to get to a prisoner, to remove a prisoner, we would have had to gone outside the prison into the interior of the courtyard, through these double doors that led to the back of the cell to get to the prisoner. And if you're thinking that seems awfully inconvenient, then you would be right. So that was abandoned again during construction. We're seeing these flaws already coming up while we're still building the prison. So 4 through 7 are built using doors, traditional doors in the cell house. So you can, you can kind of see this double door situation would have been the usage. It's hard to tell here. Here's a couple of doors we would have seen. So these are extremely old now. We would have had an outer door, a solid outer door, and then the interior door would have been a steel with a little bit of access through, and you can see this kind of gap. So this one's missing, it's steel, but then they would have had a double door there. What's interesting about this radial design, this concept, is this idea. So this spot here at center, you could look down cell block 1, 2, 3. All you would have to do is turn your body, and you would be able to look down every cell block in this original design. The problem comes in 1877. They're already building new cell blocks. So if you were standing at this point now, you can see all the way down cell block 2. But now there's going to be a cell block that if you come down here to where this light is and take a right, that would be leading you to a new hallway with a new cell block. So by that time, you've got at least 4 new cell blocks. By the end of construction, when the prison closes, there's at least 14 cell blocks, and only these first 7 would have been visible by standing at that center point. So with every new cell block that is crammed in between those original 7, you lose the ability to surveil that the radial design is designed to produce. So again, another example of how the separate and silent system is failing from the beginning. So I'm going to come back with a new video in a little bit to talk about just inmate life. I'm going to go ahead and show you a couple of pictures here. So this is the interior of cell block 7. So matching this model, the 2-tiered, you can see the inset cell. It's interesting here, the construction. You can't see down here where let me pull up this other floor. You can see this big gap where you have to step up onto the cell entryway. You can see that very clearly here where there's a rise here. That's a very unusual thing to see. You wouldn't see that in prisons now, something a physical barrier that prevents an officer from getting in or dragging an inmate out, whatever it might be. This is a recreation yard that would have been typical. So here's looking into the recreation yard from the outside wall. This is the view looking from as the prisoner came out of his cell into the recreation yard. Obviously the door would be closed, but into his private recreation yard. He would have probably about 30 minutes twice a day, a few days a week out in this recreation yard to get out of his cell. The remainder of his time would have been spent in his cell.